They were so close to a really good game with this one, but I think they missed the mark. Like me. I'm MTK, and today we are reviewing Enotria the Last Song, a game that had me absolutely stoked after playing the demo back in the summer because of how much potential I saw in this game. I really feel like it could have been a sleeper hit this year if they would have just done a couple things a little different. I mean, we saw what could happen with Black Myth Wukong, and if we're being honest, this game is much more true to the Souls-like formula than Black Myth could ever even think of. I mean, some people claim that Black Myth Wukong isn't even a Souls-like. I would not really agree with that, but I can see their point. However, Enotria is solidly in the Souls-like camp. And I think what we see with this game is that just because something sticks pretty close to the Souls formula doesn't mean that it does it well. So let's go through the good, the bad, and the disappointing. So let's start things off with the visuals. First off, the art style and aesthetic of this game are very unique, and honestly, I think it's pretty visually pleasing. And if you throw on top of that a stellar soundtrack, you have a pretty dang solid package. However, the sound design is kind of confusing to me, and I really don't know how I feel about it. The weapons and the way they sound can sometimes feel like it fits with the aesthetic and atmosphere they're going for, but at the same time, sometimes they sound very like cyborgy or sci-fi almost, and it just feels like a really weird fit. I don't really know what they were going for there. So I'm not really sure if I like it or not, but it is interesting to say the least. But one thing I do like is the Italian theater atmosphere that they've built. From the way that the world is designed to the enemies, it's all very intriguing and unique. And on the outside, it's kind of kiddish fun feeling, but it has like a dark undertone underneath it that just feels really cool. I really like the way they did that. So the visuals to me in this game are a high point. I feel like they designed it pretty well with exception to maybe the weapon sounds, but overall I think it was really creative and it has kind of a unique beauty to it. Now let's talk about the story. The game is set in the world of Enotria, a land that once thrived under the influence of the masks of change, which are artifacts that can alter reality itself. However, this land has now fallen into stagnation and decay due to the eternal play, a curse or state where change has stopped and everything is trapped in an unending cycle. You take on the role of a maskless one, a character who is free from the influence of the masks and thus capable of bringing change. The narrative revolves around the protagonist's journey to unravel the mysteries of Enotria, confront the forces that maintain the status quo, and ultimately attempt to break the cycle of the eternal play. So that's basically the gist of the story and what's going on in the game. Obviously, I'm not going to get into many details because I don't want to spoil anything, but honestly, I have to say the Italian style lore is really cool and the story is actually really good. But I don't think that they did a very good job of telling it. Everything kind of felt forgettable. And although the story is really deep and intriguing if you do a little digging, I just don't think that they communicated it very well. And I can't really put my finger on why that is, but I definitely didn't feel gripped by the story, even though on paper the story should be gripping. Overall, I would say that the story is fair. I'm not going to call it bad, because I don't think that it is bad. I just wish that they had done a little bit better job with it, because I feel like they really missed out on a golden opportunity to have one of the great stories in the Souls-like genre. And now we come to the biggest problem with this game, and that is the combat. First off, let's talk about the parry timing. The parry timing in this game is very weird. It's super tight, and you have to do it at a time in the animation that doesn't feel natural. And in a game that is so parry-centric, it really sucks that they did not do a good job on making the parries feel smooth. If you're going to make a game that influences the players to parry enemies, you better make sure that those parries are responsive and clean. And that's what's so baffling to me about this, is how did this make it through the playtests and they thought that this was okay? And to top that all off, the parry does nowhere near enough unravel, which is basically the poise in Enotria. So the fact that it's so hard to pull off a parry, and then you couple that with the fact that there's very little reward for pulling off a parry, then it just becomes very annoying and almost pointless. So you might be thinking, okay, parrying isn't very good, so just dodge instead. Well, they sucked at that too. The dodge feels just as weird as the parry does, and half the time it doesn't even work because you get like 3 iframes. So unless you hit your dodge at exactly the right time, then it's pointless to even try. This is probably the worst feeling dodge that I have ever played in a Souls-like game. Period. I feel like Enotria has a little bit of an identity problem. It's trying to be Dark Souls and Sekiro mixed together. The problem is that it does both of them pretty poorly. And here's the next big mistake. The elemental system was not very well thought out. So in Enotria, there are 4 different elements, and each one of them has a buff, but it also has a debuff. So for instance, Gratia will give you the ability to heal over time, but it also gives you the debuff of if you take damage, a large explosion will take place and take out a large chunk of your health. And that part of the system is actually pretty cool. The problem comes on the second half of the system. Each one of the elements is strong against another element, but also weak against a different one. So you might come up against an enemy that is infused with one element, and then what you're supposed to do is switch to a weapon that is infused with the element that is strong against their element, and then use that against them so that you can deal more damage. And I get what they're trying to do here. They're trying to encourage players to use a variety of builds and weapons. But it ends up just feeling annoying. People don't want to have to switch weapons every other enemy. They want to find a weapon they like, upgrade that weapon, and be able to use it effectively throughout the game. The way that you encourage variety in weapons and builds is by building a quality game that people want to play over and over again, and they will by nature experiment as they do that. You don't do it artificially by trying to force players into it. And that brings me to the boss fights. In this game, the boss fights are either way too easy, or they take all the problems that I just mentioned and they put them on steroids because the bosses have a ton of health, and so all the annoying things that you have to deal with even more with a much harder enemy. Now, if you're just jumping into the game, there are difficulty options now that did not exist at launch. So you can now toggle between story and Souls-like mode, which story mode is very easy. You'll body everything, and it's really just to experience the story. Souls-like mode is much harder, and it is pretty much identical to the difficulty of the game before they released the patch that added the difficulty modes. Now, there is one good thing I feel like they did when it came to the combat, and that is that there are plenty of weapons. They really went overboard on giving you all kinds of different options, which I really appreciate. Sometimes I feel like Souls-like games miss the mark on that pretty hard, in that they don't give players enough weapons and things to play around with. To summarize, the combat basically single-handedly sunk this game. If they would have done just a couple things different with the combat, I think they would have had a completely different game and a much better experience for the players. Now, if you made it this far into the video, chances are you're probably enjoying it. So please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Lastly, let's talk about the general gameplay. First off, it was very buggy, especially in combat. There were a ton of times where enemies just got stuck on the environment, and I was able to just smack them while they stood there helplessly. The game is fairly linear, although it does open up a little bit to allow for exploration. It's pretty similar to like a Dark Souls game as far as exploration goes, although it doesn't have anywhere near the quality of level design that those games did. There are side quests that you can do, although, much like Dark Souls again, if you aren't looking for them, you'll probably miss them. You do have to talk to the NPCs to actually find the side quests to go do. There are some really cool traversal options that they put in this game that I thought were really unique and well thought out. The leveling and progression is pretty deep and well done. Although, at first I was kind of thinking that they didn't give you nowhere near enough upgrade material, but then I realized it's probably just because the game isn't good enough for me to want to go back and farm for upgrade material. If the game was a much better experience, I probably wouldn't mind going back to the earlier levels to get some of the lower grade material to be able to upgrade through those first levels of the weapons. But the game's just not good enough for me to want to do that. Now, one other thing I thought that they did really well was the mask system. I thought it was actually kind of genius. In this game, you can set up 3 different loadouts, and each loadout has its own set of weapons that you can select, its own set of abilities, and then its mask, which is basically its armor. And each set of armor or mask has its own abilities and perks. And then you can switch between these seamlessly in the middle of combat with just a short animation. So it's kind of like a fusion of Call of Duty's loadouts into a Souls-like game. And I thought that was really neat. So in conclusion, I have to give this game an do what you want. I can't really actively advise people not to buy it, because I don't think that it's bad enough that you'll have an awful time with the game. But it's also not good enough for me to tell you that you should even consider it if it's not already on your radar. I don't regret buying the game, and I did enjoy my playthrough, but I'm not going to play it again. So there you go. Those were my thoughts. I do hope that they try and make another one and maybe improve on these things, because I do think that there's a ton of potential in this world. But for me, this game just wasn't it.